I was talking about were essentially responding to more immediate cultural challenges, and that these terms like magical realism and postmodernism didn't have much of an explanatory function, right? When it came to, I was talking about the kind of were essentially responding novelists were doing. More immediate. So he listened to me, and then at some point, these terms magic clearing out his postmodernism. Wasn't quitting. He have much of an explanatory function. Right? When it came to talking about it's a bug that's the kind of once every responding novelists would do. After a sizable, so he listened to me, and then collect on his paper. So he went through clearing out his postmodernism sort of phase, and he found have much of a explanatory function. Which he gave order about very kindly. It's a bug that's the kind of I saw it after a sizable, so he listened to me, and then a review from his terms. So he went through clearing out cleaning by the historian Gertrude Dimes, and he found and one of the names she mentioned at this point, in this moment of genteel outrage, was the name of Theodor Zelden. She said he'd written he was a historian, and he'd written a book about the French and all of that. And then he seemed to have gone over to the dark side.
And one
in
of the
some
names
sense.
she mentioned,
This is my language, not hers,
in this moment
because
of
she
genuine
declared
outrage,
apparently that
was the name of Theodore
the most
Selden.
authentic
She
way
said
of
he'd written
writing history
he was a
was
historian,
not to
and
write
he'd
it,
written
but to write
a
fiction
book
instead.
about the French,
Right?
and
And he
all of
apparently
that.
made good on
And
that
then he
promise,
seemed to have gone
right?
over
and
to
wrote
the
a
dark
novel
side. And one of the
titled
names she
Happiness. This is
mentioned,
my language, not hers.
in
Tried
this
to combine
moment of
because she had
genuine
declared
outrage,
apparently that
was
the
the name
methods
of
of
Theodore
the most
Selden.
authentic way.
So
So
this
this was
written
one of the
writing
examples
history.
she was.
He was a
Was
historian,
not to
and
write
he'd
it,
written
but to write
a
fiction
book
kind
about
of.
the French,
And he apparently degeneration
and then he
promise
seemed to have
was
gone over to
wrote
the
a
dark
novel
side. One of the
titled
names she
Happiness. This is
mentioned
my
was
language, not
modern.
hers. And then she went on to say lots of other things in the essay. But the name stuck in my head, and the audacity of the move that he had made also stuck in my head. And so I decided that I would look out for this man and try to read him if I could. This was around 95 or so. The internet had just begun arriving in Bangalore, which meant, IIC had internet, or, government offices had internet. So I decided that I would look for Zeldin where I could, which was in the bookshops which got small dribbles of new publications, or in magazines that arrived from various corners of the world. And eventually, at some point in the year 99, I laid hands on Zeldin's An Intimate History of Humanity. So this was the first book by Zeldin that I read. When I read it, I was charmed by some of the things he was attempting. And I was also, as I read and reread the book, I was also a little disturbed by, shall we say, some traditionalist preoccupations, by some concerns that seemed to me like maybe Gertrude Himmelfarb was not entirely wrong in feeling a little queasy and a little suspicious of some of these moves that he seemed to be making. Over the years, however, I've made my peace with Zeldin. Right, there are things I don't buy, and there are things that I still find quite fascinating and interesting in the kind of work that he attempted as he evolved as a historian. I don't agree now with what Himmelfarb was saying, that uh, Zeldin had a kind of road to Damascus moment when he encountered postmodernism. I think it evolved quite naturally out of his own creative dissatisfaction with traditional ways of doing academics. So Zeldin's work comes out of this dissatisfaction, this creative dissatisfaction that I'm talking about, where as an academic, you end up talking to your peers, and as a result of which, you end up talking to a circle that grows smaller and smaller, right? As academic writing becomes more focused and more grounded in what we call traditional methods of research, it also becomes less accessible to other readers, right? And eventually ends up in a sort of mathematical absurdity where your audience is sort of decreasing as you continue writing, right? I think that's the primary uh, headache or problem that Zeldin was trying to uh, raise and answer for himself. And that's a problem that I find myself sympathizing with. That's a problem which I think requires a certain kind of audacity, a certain kind of imaginative sort of adventuring with in order to uh, in order to break out of that loop. Right? So in Zeldin's work, thus, right, there is there is the question, the implicit question that he's asking, which is, what do we do with knowledge how do we look at knowledge, and what is the point to knowledge or understanding or insight if it cannot become a means by which you begin to talk about change, begin to point to a certain kind of possibility uh, in terms of change, right? So that's the question that he's trying to answer for himself through the moves that he makes, right? So to give you a kind of brief backgrounder into Zeldin and his career, he was an English academic of uh, immigrant origins. He studies first at Birkbeck College, trains in history, and eventually becomes a kind of expert in French history. Right? And in the 80s, wrote a book called The French, which attempted a kind of history of the of French culture, of the French nation and its culture, right? In which one of the first things he says is that the idea that the French are exceptional is a fiction, right? And also makes the argument that previous attempts at talking about the French have all been sort of caught up in trying to explain a distinctiveness, when instead what they could have done is talk about the infinite variations that seem to make up Frenchness. And to prove this point, he does his history in this 2-volume book by talking to a bunch of ordinary people, right? And by looking at their experiences as a way of, you know, he sort of takes these experiences and places them side by side with received accounts, with scholarly accounts, right? And sort of produces an interesting amalgam, right? Where some experiences offer you another way of looking at historical fact, where some experiences challenge quite directly historical understanding. And so the province of history opens out in an interesting sort of way. It was a much read book, much discussed book. And at some point, Zeldin was described as the most popular Englishman in France, because everyone in France who was reading, right, seemed to find something of interest in the book, either to agree with or to disagree with. It was a much discussed book in the 80s. So the postmodern moment that Himmelfarb was talking about probably happened later, but you will understand why I'm saying that Zeldin didn't have any, magical sudden moment of conversion to any sort of viewpoint. There's a certain kind of curiosity that has been in his work almost from the beginning of his academic endeavors. And that is to look at the experience of ordinary people and to understand the structures of everyday life. The moment I say everyday life, you'll also see a connection to another group of historians who seem to have had this concern, the Annales group and Vernon Brodel, right, who Zeldin read with a lot of interest and in fact has reviewed, right, at several points. Brodel himself also wrote about the French, and so it was Zeldin who was called to review this history for the London Review of Books and so on. Right? So, to my mind, someone like Zeldin thus ends up addressing this interesting question that all of us have to address in academics, which is how do you expand the province of attention, or how do you escape from the province of inattention that is apparently the unalterable destiny of the humanities. Right? As someone who, and I find Zeldin interesting because he seems to have succeeded in opening out history in an interesting way to discussion in the mass media, right? it should illustrate how successful he's been with this way of working if I tell you that at various points in time, Forbes magazine, which is a kind of business magazine, and what was that other thing called? Fast Forward, I think, another uh, transcontinental business magazine, each listed him as influential thinkers of the respective decades that they were trying to name, scholars who would impact the world of business. Right? Uh, he taught at Oxford University and was one of the founders of St. Anthony's College at Oxford. Was also a founder of one of the initiatives in studying international gastronomy at St. Anthony's College. So those are two things that he was involved in. But most interestingly, his most recent academic assignment, he's now in his late 80s, and I think has sort of retired from active teaching. But at some point, when I checked on him, right, sometime in the last 10 years, he was teaching ideas at the Scythe Business School, which is the B school that is attached to Oxford University. So what I find interesting in his trajectory is here's a humanities guy who has managed to go over to the field of commerce and management and convince them that history is something they have to pay attention to, right? So anyone who can do this sort of thing, right, is definitely some kind of academic artist, some sort of puller off of the kind of academic audacity that is required for the humanities to find relevance and to remind people that there is relevance in the work that is happening in the many fields that make up the humanities. To get to an intimate history of humanity, right? It's a book that once again attempts to sort of deliver history through conversation with ordinary people, right? So some reviewer who read An Intimate History of Humanity says it's interesting that he calls it this because there's definitely a sense of intimacy in the book, in the sense that he's talking to people and they are sort of opening up and telling him things about their lives, right? And it's interesting also that out of this mass of intimate detail, he sort of springs forward to turn them into historical observations, right? But their primary cavil was that all the people he was talking to were French. Right? How did this become a history of humanity? Right? That was one of the challenges, one of the responses a reviewer or two seems to have made. Zeldin himself answers that in the book, right, by pointing to two things that he's doing in the book. One, all the people he's talking to are women, right? And so his unsaid point is if for the longest time, the study of history has been looking at the experiences of men and considering that the experiences of men are sufficient to explain the experiences of women and other people, right? When you start by talking to women, maybe you're doing history differently, right? His other reason for talking entirely to a group of women is also something else that he says, which is interesting. He says, in our age, women seem more open to experience, more aware of their worlds than men do. Right? There's a certain kind of critique of patriarchy that he offers there, right, without getting into a kind of attack on patriarchy. Right? That witty little turn is something I was charmed by. The other thing that he says, right, is that he's addressing this question of what it is to be human. He's not claiming to represent everybody. Right? So those are his defenses for the title, An Intimate History of Humanity. And that defense I like because the discourse that he sets up is one that intersects in interesting ways with the reader's own experience and invites conversation in some sense from the reader, invites the reader to sort of pitch in and ask questions, even if you don't really have an actual chance to do that. The structure is open in this form. Right? So that's a little bit about the book. Let me sort of show you a little more of the book through a bunch of extracts, and then I'll talk a little bit about one or two things that I have sort of found interesting in terms of the connections or light it has thrown upon some things I'm thinking about. All right. So to read Zelda, I'm going to start at the end of the book, right? He produces a sort of closing explanatory note, and that's the place at which I'm going to start talking about the book, right? So he begins the book with the words, "My life is a failure." That's a sentence that one of the women he speaks to, Juliet, who's a sort of domestic servant, right? It's one of the many things she says to him, right? He comes back to that sentence in order to talk about the main point that he's trying to get at, right? So he tells us this story about this man who sort of commits a murder and is, he he sort of is sent to jail and all of that. The extract narrates this for us, right? And then he sort of is freed because he behaves in an exemplary fashion. And when he gets to go home, he finds that there's nothing that he can go home to. His family has basically disappeared in some sense, right? So he then tries to commit suicide, and that also doesn't work out. So there's failure after failure after failure, right? And he's visited by a monk at this site at this point in time, and the monk says, as you can see from Zeldin's words, that things do seem quite bleak. And then he says something simple. He says, "There's one little task I'd like you to help me accomplish." Right? And so this guy goes along with the monk, and this apparently is the story of how the Emmaus movement began. The monk he's talking about is a person known as the Abbé Pierre, right? He doesn't name the murderer who became his associate, but Abbé Pierre and this man, and then a whole lot of other people, set up what is perhaps one of the most interesting examples of what Brodel calls social kindness at work, right? Emmaus is this site in the Bible, right? This location in the New Testament where a resurrected Christ is apparently offered some hospitality by two disciples who don't recognize him, right? He's a complete stranger as far as they're concerned, and nevertheless they extend hospitality to him. So the Emmaus movement takes its inspiration from this moment, and the founding of the Emmaus movement, of the Emmaus movement, right, is something that Zeldin opens up as one sort of response to this idea of failure, but more importantly, as a kind of possibility in what he sees as the new ways of looking at history that are possible. Right? The Juliet who says my life is a failure, and this unnamed uh, ex-convict who says my life is a failure are both people who are writing histories of their lives in a certain way. Right? It takes new spectacles, new ways of looking at their lives for that history to change, for that history to seem less inevitable, and for other possibilities to emerge. Right? It's this that Zeldin sees as a skill that the humanities, specifically as a matter of academic training like history, ought to be translating into ordinary language for students and for others. Um, so this is the point at which he brings the book to land. He makes several such points in the last section of the book, right? So he looks at religion, and this is something that I found interesting, right? He says two things, right? One is that bhakti involves the art of listening and befriending. Right? He's making this larger point about how there are new possibilities for conversation, even as there are ideological divides and impasses of various kinds bedeviling our world. He says that there exist these new possibilities for conversation, and so even something like religious dogma, right, is undone by the recognitions that it also contains as alternative voices within itself, right? The other example that he offers is that of the Warsaw rabbi, right, who sort of plays on the two words Yahid and Yahad, right? That these two things are ultimately matters of perspective, right? So his point is that while religion may have caused some of the greatest wars and the greatest amount of bloodshed in history, right? It's nevertheless a matter of what you choose to view and what you choose to take from religion that allows us to change history. Changing history for Zeldin is an important concern, and that is what he's addressing through these examples. Here's another one, right, when he talks about how it's possible to do something like economics in a completely different way, right? So he says it's not necessary to, so he's in argument with Adam Smith here and his idea of the invisible hand, all of which says that the forces that constitute the market are ultimately produced by self-interest, and more importantly, by rational self-interest, right? His point of view is that economics has to begin to change and to begin to regard itself differently in the light of what we are learning about humanity, about human behavior, right? And so he talks about this very interesting conceit called two-eyed economics or a two-eyed politics, right? Which is one that acknowledges that there is self-interest, yes, right? But there is also the possibility of selflessness. There is rationality in how human beings act around money, but there is also irrationality, right? And the moment your understanding of people, right, changes to incorporate all of these, it becomes possible to practice economics differently, right? Similarly with politics, where he talks about this thing called mutually acceptable alternative victories, right? Um, you can sense management speak such as think win-win here, but I think he's talking about something slightly more sophisticated. Um, this is the idea that he's trying to sort of get at. He states it more clearly out here, right? Which is that the possibilities of individuals reaching out to each other, to one another, and to thus build a kind of network of cooperation through conversation by setting aside uh, most conventional ways of looking at other people and being open to experience, open to difference. Right? He sees that as a profoundly transformative force, and one that the unstated assumption in the book, the unstated proposition in the book, is that this openness is something that can come from the humanities. So this is the mode on which the note on which the book closes, right? And it sort of represents the thing that Zeldin is trying to do, which is how do you take an understanding and turn it into a program that is useful for ordinary people, for people outside of academics? How do you turn these ideas into things that work in the everyday? That's the concern that seems to drive an intimate history of humanity. Um, right, so that's the quote that we began with, how something like this can be transformed, how transformation can come out of small acts of unselfishness. There's also the method that he uses in the book, which is what I find quite fascinating. Now, a good part of what he's saying here treads very uncomfortably for me into the zone known as self-help, right? And the thing that rescues it for me is the manner in which he's talking about how a historian has to perhaps learn to talk to somebody from a completely different discipline. If you're talking to somebody from the sciences, what do you say to him or her? If you're talking to somebody from uh, more occult fields like commerce and management, what do you say to them? Right? That's the interesting set of possibilities he seems to offer, like I've said before. We'll get now to what he's doing in the book, which is perhaps a lot more interesting because it has many more possibilities, right, than what he does towards the end of the book. Um, One of the things that happens is the manner in which the book is structured. One of the places where his method is visible, right? So all these are chapter titles, right? And what they offer is a kind of focus on ordinary questions and how these ordinary questions can lead to surprising historical connections and revelations, right? Um, I specifically like chapter titles such as number 17, which is how travelers are becoming the largest nation in the world and how they have learned not to see only what they are looking for. Um, the Economist at some point carried a sort of semi-satirical article on how frequent flyer miles, right, benefits given to travelers who take flights frequently, was slowly becoming a very influential kind of unofficial currency, right? And that's one of the things he's referring to when he says they're becoming the largest nation in the world, right? Um, there are also other interesting chapter titles which I haven't shown you in this screenshot, right? Such as why is it genuinely difficult for men and women to become friends? Sorry, it's right here, number 18. Why friendship between men and women has been so fragile, and so on, right? So the questions that he articulates as chapter titles, right, uh, become the takeoff point for a series of meditations. The questions come from the conversations he has. So each chapter has, one person who he has met somewhere in France, right? Uh, it's it develops from the conversation he has with them, And then it becomes this question, and out of that question comes a kind of historical music. He says, my method tries to achieve both a microscopic view and a telescopic view, right? So this is the microscopic at work, right? He's talking to Juliet. This is the opening of the book, right? He meets Juliet. He talks to her. He talks to her about what matters to her. So Juliet is somebody who has spent all her life as a domestic servant, right? And she has aged, which means that she can't do as much work as she once could, right? But needs to stay alive, needs an income, and so has to figure out new ways of conserving energy and making sure that she has enough money to take care of herself, right? This account of private life, private and working life together, right, becomes a way by which Zeldin is able to look at what the free market economies are not able to do for people who are able to work, willing to work, right? And at the same time, it also becomes a means by which he is able to chart freedoms that have become available as societies have changed, right? And allowed women to become people who are capable of defining substantiality for themselves. So his curiosity travels in both these directions. So from the microscopic, right, which is to zoom in, which is part of my title today, to zoom into ordinary life, he finds that Juliet has a bunch of health issues that trouble her, but not so much as her relationship issues, right? The man she was once married to, the man she's with now, right? The fact that she doesn't get along quite well with this new man's stepdaughter, the fact that she has all kinds of opinions about immigrants coming in and taking away work. He listens to all of this, right? And out of that microscopic vision comes a bunch of historical reflection. So that's the telescopic part of his account. He does this carefully across every chapter. So when he does the telescopic, what questions arise? One of the things that I found most interesting, right, is this response that he makes, right? One is that this idea of the independent human being capable of trading labor for work, right, is in some sense an evolving construction, right? And this is when he begins talking about the idea of slavery, right? It's a very beautiful sort of disquisition upon slavery that follows. And as I read it, right, one of the things I realized is that in all the cultural criticism that we have produced in India, right, when we talk about caste and when we talk about the provisions of caste, the S word is something that is never used, right? I don't know for what reason or motivation it is, but for the longest time, the closest we have come to acknowledging the existence and the persistence of slavery in our cultures is in terms such as bonded labor in the modern democratic state, right? Or in historical accounts when we talk of some communities being service castes, right? What the term service caste hides is the fact that those people were supposed to give labor in return for food. They couldn't trade labor. They couldn't go to a better employer if they wanted to, right? They couldn't strike out on their own. They had no benefits apart from the fact that their material needs would be taken care of, right? And so, in some sense, right, the primary kinds of dehumanization that caste produced was essentially a sophisticated form of slavery, right? Now, is this lack of acknowledgement of slavery as an essential component of caste in India, right? Where does it come from? Is it a motivated sort of construction of euphemisms? Is it an inability to face up to that fact, right? Is it because it's inconvenient to a moral high ground we could claim for an Indian civilization, right? But the moment you start thinking about Indian society in terms of caste being a way of organizing slavery, organizing slave labor, right? It immediately clarifies several questions in terms of uh, a larger political understanding. And that's something that is an example of what I was saying before, of the sort of spaces that his writing creates for you to take questions back to the context you know and to apply some of the kinds of curiosity he's practicing to the context you know. So the question that continues to interest me and continues to bother me is, why is there that avoidance of acknowledging the fact that slavery was practiced and continues to be practiced wherever uh, caste drives the economy? Something else I wanted to say, it slipped my mind. It'll come back to me at some point. Right. So I've left you with this little sort of sample to show you what the telescopic part of his method is. There's a third part to the method, and that is something that he calls suggestive reading. Right? So at the end of every chapter, there's one broad set of references. Right? There's a certain way in which he's parodying academic writing, which will require you to do a kind of works cited, etc. What he does is to sort of turn it into, you read what you find interesting in this list, right? Method of acknowledging and giving credit, right? While at the same time also opening up this idea of conversation for the reader. So the point that I'd like to bring this little presentation on Zeldin to rest, right, is this idea of the practitioners of the humanities being able to make some gestures of audacity, some moves of audacity in order to go beyond a traditional audience, in order to open up public conversations or public interactions in ways that are useful to people, in ways that give people a certain kind of understanding of everyday politics, an understanding of how everyday circumstances can be altered. I'll stop the presentation part of today's talk here. If there are questions, please do put in your questions. Over to you, Dr. Tausif.
Yes. Thank you, sir, for enlightening and thoughtful talk. I'm sure that this has increased the curiosity level among the students and especially the audience. So, if anybody has any questions, so you are free to write in the chat box, and if you would like to unmute and speak, that is also okay. So, Achut, can you please also check on the YouTube that whether there is a question or query for sir? Sir, there is a question in the chat box. So, could you please take up this, or you want me to read this?
Not to worry, I'll look at the question. I can see it too. So this is Shifali's question. In many ways, I feel like my world is too small, like I'm not looking beyond myself. How do you manage to become aware of the world outside and talk about it more? All right. Now, this is a genuine problem for people caught up in a world where the nature of work has changed so as to A, occupy a lot of your time, and B, leave you so exhausted that the only thing you want to do is go home and, get some Netflix or something organized in such a way that you can binge mindlessly. Right? So the thing that one can see in this scenario that I'm painting is that there is a certain sort of oppressiveness about certain structures, but there's also a kind of opportunity to deal with that oppressiveness. It calls for a kind of creativity, right? At least in terms of not simply going back home to Netflix, which is simply another way of sort of suspending thought and judgment and all of that, right? So the one answer to that question would be to talk to people more at the workplace, or to find other worlds apart from your workplace to be in. Right? That's an everyday possibility, I think. Even if you can't do it every day, you can do it some of the time. But I think as teachers, we occupy a position of great advantage and privilege when it comes to a problem like this, right? Simply because as teachers, we get to meet so many students, and we have choices and opportunities there. You can play by the system and just do your work and have no conversation whatsoever, or you can choose to subvert that requirement, which is a clock watching, uh, do a quantum necessary kind of approach, and keep the spaces open, the available spaces open for conversation, for interaction, for whatever. Right? One of the most signal experiences I've had in the last 3 months is when a student from second year CPE came to me and said he was in all kinds of attendance trouble, right? And he didn't seem to want to say very much. I sort of asked him a bunch of questions, and we eventually found that his circumstances were so indigent, right, in the sense that he came from a home where there was one phone that had to be shared between him and a younger brother, right? And that this simple requirement immediately made the business of attending classes in the normal sense quite difficult, right? And other questions I asked him revealed that that his ability to survive this far, right? His mother uh, and father both worked inside the casual labor sort of sector of employment. And so that placed very serious restrictions on what was possible for them, right? The thing that seemed to have got him through school and through PUC and all the way to a degree at St. Joseph's College was the fact that there was an Ambedkar Phule center in his locality that had been put together by not by government effort or funding, not by NGO support, but through a self-help mechanism in the community, right? 2 or 3 people had sort of studied and got jobs, and they had set up this service, which other people had gotten involved in, right? They had a small reading room, they had a few books, and they provided advice and counseling for people who wanted to study, who wanted help with exams, with entrance exams, and so on, right? Now, this story, I mean, it's a fairly common kind of story, this sort of thrust and initiative towards self-help. But to see it in the life of a student like this, to see it beginning to transform his life was something that I was completely, blown away by, right? And so I think the point I was making is that as teachers, when we are open to conversation, when we are open to conversation with those who don't converse, most specifically, because the other story that the student told me when I asked him, why didn't you come and seek help before? Right? The story he told me was that he came to an online class, and in the very first online class, when he saw how well people were speaking English, he decided never to open his mouth because he didn't want to be found out as somebody who didn't speak English a certain way. I think I learned several things out of that conversation, right? And I think the things you learn like this make your practice a little sharper, perhaps a little better, because your imagination is also called into work, right? I think something like that is one kind of answer to your question, Shefali. Right? So it's not about your having to make yourself aware, right? If you stop and listen, right, you can have awareness arrive all by itself. You can have your imagination wake up all by itself.
Mini ma'am has shared her experience, and she's trying to say that she finds her identity, what Zeldin's book mentions.
Yeah, Juliet's story about, having to produce another self outside of the home, right, in order to be able to, come back home and have a home that is one's own. Yes. Yeah, you should read the book, Mini. It's a very interesting book, primarily because of the many things that the women in the book.
Sure. I will take it from you. Thank you.
Sure.
There is another question in the chat box, sir. How do we know which one of our curiosities to focus on and which ones to let go for another time?
Right. It's a good question because, as you're pointing out, the possibilities that arise are many. Right? I don't think there's a manual or a master plan or a script by which you can choose what to prioritize. But I think the sensible response is to see what you're able to do at that moment, right? And to go by that. Right? If you have a very strong sense of right and wrong, it it may be possible to look at the things that are in front of you and to say, okay, this has to be addressed, because not to address it would compound a kind of injustice. It's sometimes possible to do that, not always. So that's another way of looking at it as well. Thank you for the question, Anushka.
Dr. Achut, could you please check, are there any questions on YouTube as well? Because in the chat box on Teams, I cannot see any question. Could you please confirm? Dr. Achut, can you hear me? Okay, so there is no question. So thank you very much, sir, for this enlightening and thought-provoking session and talk. And of course, this has enriched my knowledge in person, and of course, this has enriched others' knowledge about what you were talking about. So quickly moving towards the next presentation. So the next presentation and the next presenter is Philip Victor. So quickly I'll introduce about him. And the most fascinating thing that I can see about Philip Victor, that he is a writer, at the same time theater performer and visual artist based in Thrissur. He's a graduate from Ambedkar University, a popular university located in national capital Delhi. And Philip's interest area lies in understanding the body and its involvement in the production of theater and art. So his topic for the presentation is horror as a tool to examine mutual relations in the family. So I'd request Professor Philip to just begin the talk now.
Hello everyone. I am sitting in my school. I studied here from kindergarten to 10th standard. So where I am right now is the Parambu. You can see banana plants behind me. To my this side, there is a pond. The people here call this pond Bhagavad-Gita. And that is because this pond, which is triangular shaped, is facing the temple right opposite. And the goddess in the temple is called Chirangolangara Bhagavati. So it is believed that during this time, in the evening and early in the morning, around 5 o'clock, the goddess comes to this pond here and takes a bath. Right next to this pond is another pond. There I come and take a bath in the evenings. So if this causerie was not happening, I would have been taking a bath there in that pond. I will try to show you the Bhagavati Kulam. Human being is a social creature. Life for them cannot go on without forming associations. From this need to exist in social groupings, the institutions of family, marriage, and kinship came into being. Families act as the most basic institution of every society and differ in organization and structure. It is idealized that the primary functions of a family is to socialize and nurture young generations. The members of each family unit are bounded by ethical and moral obligation to perform certain roles. It becomes their responsibility to teach their offspring values and morals necessary to exist within a particular socio-cultural framework. Every family is therefore the working unit of a larger system, a network that incorporates cultural relations, religious ideologies, and democracy. The persistence of male domination in the society developed over the span of human history. It was so much part of social life to the extent that it was not even identified as a concept. The power of patriarchy lies in its capability to make itself as invisible as possible. The age of patriarchy, how an unfashionable idea became a rallying cry for feminism today. It's an article by Charlotte Higgins, Guardian. Patriarchy is based on two principles. The first being that the male shall dominate the female, and the second being that the older male shall dominate the younger male. In her book titled Seeing Like a Feminist, Nivedita Menon refers to the family as an institution with legal identity. Menon points out that the state only recognizes patriarchal heterosexual families while disregarding the rights of people belonging to the LGBTQ+ category. Therefore, the state-approved family, according to her, is an institution that is based on inequality, and its function is plainly to perpetuate particular forms of private property, ownership, and lineage. The existing social order demands to be questioned, and the system's way of assigning roles to individuals on the basis of their gender and sexuality needs to be countered with resistance. It is important to make sure that each member of a household is to be treated with respect and their thoughts and opinions are rightfully valued. In the absence of mutual respect between members of a family, basic rights of individuals could be compromised, their thoughts and feelings neglected, decisions disregarded, and productivity suppressed. Fear is often associated with concern. The fear of something makes us more aware of a person, an object, or a phenomenon. Fear can be used to put across a thought or idea with greater intensity into the minds of the reader. Horror in itself is an animal's response to a disturbance in natural order. Horror has the power to embed an idea or thought in a person's mind quicker than any other genre can achieve. The idea of horror is not merely an obscure notion. It is a serviceable concept which is capable of communicating and receiving information. Horror can be used as a tool to question limits of knowledge, experience, and selfhood. And it lies closer to the edge of man's scientific understanding of the world. The Indian family system does not treat all of its members as equal. Most Indian communities follow the patrilineal system of descent, where the father figure is given primeval importance. The psyche of the female is subjugated and religiously conditioned to accept subordination. As much as it is a space of entertainment and excitement, of terror and dread, horror is also capable of relishing complexities that arise when boundaries of taste, of bodies, of reason are blurred. As much as it is a site of exploration and expression, horror leverages the narratives of the reproductive, the maternal, and sexual to expose the underpinnings of the social, political, and philosophical othering of women. In other words, the feminine identity occupies a place of privilege within the context of the horror narrative. The ability of horror to merge women's bodies with domestic spaces allows the possibility of opening up the house to the male audience and provide them with the opportunity to directly observe and experience hierarchies of power within the members of the house from the point of view of the oppressed. In this manner, it becomes possible to help trace the unsaid and unseen of culture, that which has been silenced, made invisible, covered over, and made absent. Over the years, horror has been used to scare people into accepting their social roles. It can also be used to make people rethink social roles and question those who make them. Horror can be used to make them identify the various forces that may be making them accept certain roles of functioning. What I'm going to do now is that I'm going to read you guys a part of something that I had written. This was it was a 9-chapter novel titled "The Color of My Skin." I wrote this novel. I'm only going to read a small part of this novel. Drunkard Suganan killed his wife and 2 children 5 years ago. Sharath and Saumya were too young to face death. After strangling his wife with the telephone cord, Sugunan hid her in the closet. Reports state that he mixed rat poison in the children's meal and fed them the poisoned food. In the hall of their house, Sugunan hanged to death. Neighbors found him hanging naked from the ceiling fan in the dining room a week later. By then, the bodies had begun to decay, filling the neighborhood with the unbearable stench of rotting flesh. The plot adjacent to Sugunan's plot belongs to Mohan and Nambiar, a little over an acre. The plot is home to an array of cashew trees, red and yellow fruit-bearing varieties. Close to the boundary that separates the plot from Sugunan's compound is a tall jackfruit tree towering over Sugunan's house. The tree seasonally drops monstrous jackfruits as food for the hundreds of animals that relish their sweetness. The jackfruit tree isn't the Varikya variety, which is often compared to honey in songs and poems. This tree belongs to the Kura variety, which can easily choke a careless toddler if he tries to eat the fruit fast. It may not be visible to all, but those who have wandered into Nambiar's land would know that the compound hides a pond right in the center. A pond topped with water lilies. Even if the sun tried with all its might to send a ray of light down to the bottom of the pond, it simply wouldn't be able to. Mohan and Nambiar worked in an oil company for over 30 years. When he returned from the Gulf, he had enough money saved up to build the Nambiar building in the center of the town. With the leftover from his savings, Nambiar opened a jewellery shop with the name Nambiar and Sons Jewellery in the year 1990 in his own building. What is, however, funny about the name is that Nambiar never married and had no children. In the middle of that year, Nambiar was accused of possessing smuggled gold. He was found guilty by court, following which he disappeared. There were rumors going around saying that Nambiar fled to the Gulf and was living the life of the Sultan himself. Only Nambiar knows where he is now. His properties were seized by the government. Nambiar's ancestral home, the new building and the jewellery shop, and the land he owned next to Sugunan's home. From that day on, the land that earlier belonged to Nambiar became everyone's land. When nobody looked, lovers vanished into the thorny bushes because nobody noticed them there. Then there were some who lit beedies and hid in the unoccupied bushes to watch the lovers embracing each other. You could only tell them from the red glow in some bushes that twinkled as they sucked at their beedies deeply. Neighbors stormed the land to get hold of every single cashew nut that fell from the cashew trees. If the coconut trees dropped coconuts, it belonged to them. People dug up arrowroot plants to steal the roots when it was time for harvest. Drunkards occupied the abandoned cowshed to play cards, down local arrack, and sulk about their miserable lives. Soon the pond filled up with crushed plastic glasses, half-sucked pickle sachets, and bottles that contained a little bit of alcohol stuck to the ridged wedges. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I can see one question in the chat box from our colleague, Lily Kuti Abraham. Is the novel published?
No, sir, I didn't publish the novel. I have to publish it someday. I'm not happy with it, so
Okay, not a problem. Yes, there is one hand up. So could you please ask your question, Enstina?
Ah, yes, sir. So the theatrical elements you used of speech and music and acting really enthralled us. Thank you so much for that, sir. And one aspect I would like to speak about is your act of trying to kill a mosquito in the beginning of your speech. It was so natural. So could you please give us more details regarding about this aspect, because it was beautiful. It came out really well, sir.
I really don't know. Some of these things come to us when we do things, no? So
That's right. That's right. And it
I
was beautiful.
thank you. I am sitting in a paramba, as you can see, and there are mosquitoes here.
I think when you were speaking about the power of human beings, you immediately killed one mosquito there, and it was beautiful how that came in place. I think.
Thank you so much. I it it just occurred to me when I read it, so that's just it.
Thank you, sir.
There is another question in the chat box. Can you talk a little bit about the process of writing it?
So this was part of my dissertation. So this whatever work that I presented right now, it was part of my dissertation, where in my first semester of doing MA in Literary Arts and Creativity, I had to work with a concept note, and I chose to work. So the one thing that drove me towards this was the fact that in the newspapers, you keep seeing all these newses like father kills son out of anger, mother chokes her children, and all these kind of negative news. And I thought, what could possibly be happening to people? And I thought, is there something to be addressed here? Something going wrong? And then the tone of all these things were very violent and um, very ruthless. And then I thought of coming up with the genre of horror, because this genre has a power to get things into people's heads. Did I deviate from the question that was asked? About the process was the question.
Yeah. So this was about the process of writing
this book. So every semester we had to write. I mean, every week we had consistent writing work to do, and these writings would be discussed with the faculty and as well as the students. So there were 13 students in my class. So all 13 of us had to read each other's works also. And there would be a discussion session in class, which would be 2 hour long. And in this discussion, we would be getting feedbacks and possible ideas to work more. So then in my about when my first year was about to end, I had to be done with the first draft of my novel. It was 9 chapters long. Then in the next year, I had to sit and rework each chapter, and I also had to see if whatever concept that I had in mind was coming in through and getting carried through each chapters. So if that was not happening, we could go and have a discussion with my faculty, and then they would tell me to, they would give me directions as to, how to work on it and get it better. That's basically like the process.
Thank you. There are like compliments and questions in the chat box that I can see. So from Vijay Lakshmi ma'am, there is a compliment for you. Excerpt of the novel is too good. Please publish. Right.
Yes, ma'am.
So yeah, another compliment kind of thing, and like more particular, this is the question from Mini ma'am. How long did you take to write it? Do go ahead and publish it. Good luck with it.
Ma'am, I took around 1 year to write it, and then another year to rewrite it once again. Sir, could you please elaborate a little more on the idea of the feminine identity in horror and its connection to domestic spaces and home? Yes. So there is. Could you please elaborate a little more on the idea of the feminine identity in horror? Whenever we look at any horror film or any horror book, we do find that women are always considered as monsters, and women are always pictured in a very negative manner. And it's quite interesting because I hadn't added that in this presentation, but we are constantly living in a world where men are writing for men. So only one part of only now, very recently, only things have started to change. Even if we look at movies, I don't know if you can see a male ghost anywhere. Are you guys aware of any male ghosts in movies? This is happening because there's some kind of a monstrosity thing that is being assigned to women. There's always the need for, men believe that there is always a need to, correct women and, make them walk through through a certain kind of a path, that which they have decided for women without, making them think for themselves. And in horror, there is a lot of freedom and power that is given to women. If I don't know if you are familiar with the tales of Yakshi, where Yakshi is an evil spirit. She is a woman who has the freedom to walk around at night and be with the men she desires, and she has complete freedom. So in some sense, there is a lot of power that is assigned to the women in the genre of horror, and if it can be put to use to say something, it would be a very very efficient tool to communicate something if you want to say. Yes. Initially, I was wondering why you wanted the audience to see the pond. You have placed the novel in the right setting. Would like to read the entire novel. Please do publish it. Now let me ask, what was your intention of selecting this location for today's presentation? This novel, I wrote this novel keeping in mind this setting, and I have written this novel on the basis of my interactions on this property and the stories that I've heard from people. So I thought, since I was reading that excerpt, I thought that I should sit here and then read this excerpt in this very point from where all this thought originated to write the novel. So that's why I chose to write here. Ma'am, horror is one of those genres that, when done right, can create the most human of characters. Is there any particular piece of literature that you think has such characters, sir? There is one novel by a writer called P.F. Matthews called Chavanilam. And that is one novel that I like reading. I've also read another book of his called Irittilari Punyalan. Both these books are really good. And I had, read those books for inspiration for my novel. Create the music. Yeah, I think that's it.
Dr. Ashut, could you please check on YouTube whether there is any question or not?
Excuse me, this is Aloysius. Hello?
Yes, please go ahead, Aloysius.
Yeah, am I audible enough? Yeah, that was quite a very interesting presentation, and the theme itself has a lot of scope, and you have explored quite a lot. So I was quite very intrigued by this idea of the yakshi that you are bringing in. So the yakshi does often represent the character of a woman figure, a supernatural figure who was repressed. The repressed desires of a woman can be seen in the yakshi. I think the same can be observed if we take the case of the devis as well. So it would be good if we can look into the origin myths of the yakshis and the devis, and then build around how the feminine identity as two different poles can be identified in the yakshis and the devis. Because if we look at the Western context, there is this there was all this witch hunting, and also all the myths and the legends associated with witch hunting and witches, etc. So from the Western context, when there are many feminists who have worked upon how the figure of the witch represents the idea of the woman in a male-centered society as those women who would go beyond social restrictions as becoming witches. So in the Indian context, we would be able to, I think, if we look at the origins around all these the myths and legends of the yakshi and the devis, we would be able to throw some light on them.
Yes, sir.
Would you like to comment further on it?
It is actually true, sir, that there is. It's not just demonic or evil spirits. There's also godly characters that are attributed, like in the case of goddesses, and it is interesting to look at the various stories. I could tell you one story of a temple. It was actually a sacred grove called Goblichi Kava. Goblichi was the Devi there. She was actually a witch kind of a. She was actually a demonic spirit, Goblichi, and this story I've listened to the story from my Malayalam teacher, and he told me that when he was a child, it was scary to go to this sacred grove because they were scared that the demon would be sitting on top of the banyan tree and would try to jump on you if you came there with a bad intent, or if you had a bad thought in your mind when you visited the sacred grove. You could expect the demon to jump from the banyan tree and fall on you and it can possess you, it seems. And right now, some 7 or 8 years, I think 10 or 20 years after, now there is no more Goblichi Kava. This entire place has changed into Komalakshi Devi Kshetram. So what has happened to this demonic spirit is that this demonic spirit has become a god. And now there is no Goblichi, there is only Komalakshi Devi. It's actually quite interesting to listen to all these stories. And then the watchman here in this property, his name is Shashiyatan. Shashiyatan used to live in this property. His father was the bullock cart rider here. On the left side there are fields, and the place where I'm sitting right now, this is also a field that was filled with soil and transformed into land. So the Shashiyatan says that he has seen fires breaking out in different parts of this property, and the reason for this, he's saying that it's because of something else called Kuttichatan. which is there in this property. Kutichadana is again another demonic spirit, but it's not very harmful. It only does mischief. So there are lots of stories connected with the land and these myths. So I don't know if I've.
Yes, thank you, Philip. That does throw further light upon the topic. The thing is that it would be very interesting research if we can bring together such legends and myths and the origins and everything, and then try to understand in what social context they originated. And then definitely we would be able to understand how sometimes repressed people in different communities of the societies have sometimes been represented through certain supernatural characters.
Yes, sir.
Especially those characters that are associated with horror and other things.
Yes, sir, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Lily Kuti ma'am has said, can you explain the land-human connection with regard to your work? I don't think that human beings, or as a matter of fact, any animal can be seen separate from the land that it inhabits. And it is important to situate this writing in a particular kind of a locality and in a particular kind of a space. And for me personally, I cannot think that we are made of so many things that where we exist, and our bodies are very closely linked to the land that we inhabit. In my work, I have been hearing stories in relation to people who have lived on this property, and and there's also this fact that this land is also not just ours. It belonged to so many people before it got passed on to us. So I feel like it contains traces of it. So this land contains traces of many people who have lived here and died here. So that I felt like that was very crucial for my novel. So I thought of putting that in and giving importance to the land also. Thank you, Mini ma'am.
Yes, there are compliments for you in the chat box. That the session was very engaging, very informative. Eventually, I enjoyed like the way you started, especially that the device. I cannot like call the name of that particular device. The way you like just started music with that. Yeah. So really, that was very wonderful. So if there are no more questions, so officially we come to an end of the session. So on this note, we have entered the final moments for this session, where I feel privileged to propose a vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank our Department of English to conduct a wonderful Causerie event, where our students with faculty members are fortunate to connect with today's speaker. I must mention a deep sense of appreciation to our beloved HOD, Professor Arul Mani, for his constant support and motivation. I sincerely thank our team for motivated and hardworking faculty members for joining this session. And finally, I would like to thank our students for paying their valuable attention and for joining the session. Once again, I would like to thank you all for joining the session. Thank you all, and thank you to Ajut as well for conducting this smooth session. This time, hopefully, we'll come up with more causeries in future as we have diverse expertise in terms of our faculties. They belongs to different arena and experiences. So hopefully, we'll come up with more causeries in future. So thank you all for the participation and making this event wonderful and engaging too. Shall we end up this event now, Dr. Ashut? Okay. So have a safe time, and thank you for your participation.